All right. Well, we are now live. So thank you very much, Lynn, for joining us for the Hangout. Look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. Lynn Green will be speaking to us for about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on the questions that we get. He's been involved with Youth at the Mission for many years, currently located in Harpenden in the United Kingdom. He served as the chairman of Youth of the Mission for quite a few years and is now on the eldership of Youth of the Mission globally. So he's in a very unique position to help us understand the transition that we're going through as a mission into the eldership model. And Lynn, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share.
Thanks very much, Bill. Thanks a lot for moderating this and for organizing it in the first place, and for the idea to do these on a fairly regular basis. And we pray that we'll have a lot more of the family being drawn together in months and years to come. It's great to have people from all over tuning in, and I'd like to see, ideally every base everywhere, because we talk about the things that are common to our family. And this one, of course, is about the implications of eldership. And we referred to Andy Elliott's really good article up on YWAM.org. And then I wrote a little intro to that and some background in the last couple of weeks. So that's another posting that's up that people can have a look at. I think on any subject, it's really helpful to understand the context in which a message or a letter or whatever has been written. I think, for example, when I first heard somebody explain that Romans was written by Paul when the Jews who had been exiled from Rome under one emperor were allowed to come back under the next emperor. They had been the leaders of the church, but when they came back, the church with just Gentile leadership had got on fine without them, and were really, there was a bit of resentment about them coming back, and there was some us and them between the returning Jews and the Gentiles. When I saw that and started reading that book through that particular lens, I thought, boy, a lot of what he's reading makes a different kind of sense when you think about that. So the context of this word about eldership for YWAM is really important, I think. And the first time that we had it, I don't think I got even a fraction of the implications of what God was saying, because it was in the context of a lot of what was great risk and trauma as we look back. It was at that time when mercy ships had said they wanted to be completely separate from YWAM, and that was a long time coming. It was very painful, but it was something that in the end had to happen because of the direction that mercy ships had chosen to go, and it was really painful, but a relief. But also it was a time when we were about to face some massive struggles with indebtedness at Kona, because while Lauren was away sort of resurrecting the ministry in Lausanne, Kona had gotten further and further and further in debt, and the debt was really high interest. So the payments were massive every month, and the bond company was about to foreclose on the Kona campus. I'm not even sure we knew that at the time, but obviously God knew it. So the picture, the first time we heard this came from the message that has been called often since then the tripod message, and it was that message by Lauren saying, how can we be a movement where people are free to hear from God, and everybody expects to hear from God, and everybody hears and obeys, and yet we have protection. And he talked about hearing from God and the protection of eldership. And I don't know how many people remember. Most YWAMers would have heard it or read it. The picture that God had given Lauren when he came off a time of prayer and fasting, it was 2002, was of a story from his youth of two boys in a boat in the river above Niagara Falls that had tied up for the night, and the rope had come loose, and they were drifting down, and they were caught on a rock right at the edge of the falls and were eventually rescued. And God spoke to Lauren and said, I've rescued Youth with a Mission. You're not going over the falls to your destruction. Well, we were very grateful for that, but I think kind of oblivious to what the potential or impending destruction was. Now, after years of unpacking that and more prophetic teaching coming from different sources, we realized that God was rescuing us from the whole, several things, but the big thing in relation to eldership was that God was rescuing us from thinking of ourselves as an organization. Because there are a number of things about an organization which doesn't really fit the body of Christ. And God was wanting to reshape us in a different mold. And it's funny, still these days when I try to put it into words, it doesn't sound that radical, but when the shift happens in your heart, it really is very radical. Because in organizational thinking, there are a number of things about it. One is you have organizational positions have titles, and titles themselves are a source of power and authority that goes to whoever has that title, whether or not they actually deserve that in themselves. Do they have the spiritual authority for it? Well, if they have the title of director of something, then they have that authority, whether they deserve that in who they are, intuitively or intrinsically. So that was one aspect. But also in organizations, you're inevitably, with a title comes a certain amount of control, of usually finance, and then finance is like the language of power, or the currency of power. And there was a while in YWAM where, as YWAM leaders, I was one of those. We felt as international leaders, we had a lot of responsibility. We had to go to conferences. We had to get together 2 or 3 times a year in different places, and so we started setting up funds that YWAM was to pay tithes into, or YWAM bases would tithe into, and if we kept going that way down the road, some YWAM leaders might have actually been controlling very large amounts of money. And everything changes when people have a lot of money associated with an office. Let me try to use an illustration that came to me strongly in the last couple of days. I hope it's not offensive, but I think the current Pope, from all I know of people who know him and all that he's said and done, I think he's a fantastic guy. Boy, am I grateful for that. But when he stands up on the balcony at St. Peter's and he's got the gold staffs and there's all that wealth and all the artwork and all those incredible buildings and a small city-state in its own right, in spite of the fact that he talks about the importance of ministering to the poor and he washes the feet of people with disabilities and he washes and kisses the feet of women and things like, he breaks all the rules and he refuses to live in the papal apartments and all that. Nevertheless, to the whole world, there is a big disconnect with what he says and the projection of power that comes from standing on that balcony with all that represents and all the wealth and history behind it. And YWAM's nowhere like that, and wouldn't be. But down the road, we could have become increasingly powerful with wealth and clout in terms of the world. And isn't it important to realize that Jesus, God the Holy Trinity, in his planning for redemption, it seemed like he did everything possible to avoid any projection of human power in the slightest way. Where he was born, the family he was born into, the standing that he had, the trade that he had, everything about it was powerless, 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 powerless. So the only thing that distinguished Jesus was the spiritual authority he had on his life because of what he did, the fruit he bore, the authority he had on his words, who he was. And And what we've been trying to do, I think one of the implications is moving away from any kind of organizational or positional or financial power into a kind of leadership where people lead on the basis of who they are and who God has made them to be, and the authority that they have in other people's eyes. That's the only thing Jesus left behind. You know, he did not leave any heritage of wealth and power. He just left men. Don't you love it in that passage in early Acts where John and Peter are arrested after healing the man who was lame, and they recognized that they were unschooled, but they recognized that they had been with Jesus, and they were amazed at the authority they had. And that's what we're trying to move towards. You lead in this movement because God has put His Spirit on you, and people recognize that, and they happily rally around you and follow. So that's a huge change. That we're understanding that slowly as we go along. I have a recent email from one of our leaders in Africa, and Africa is one of those places where leadership is pretty much of a hierarchy, and positions, and big man is the normal cultural concept. And one of our leaders there was saying, it's taken a long time, but recently we all got it. And he said, such a load lifted off of me. And that's the other thing, that sometimes when you have organizational thinking and you're called a director of something, that puts a whole bunch of responsibility on you that's just too heavy to carry. The director has to be responsible for everything, and that's very often a load that just about breaks people. So that's important too. Also, what other implication is, when you have an organizational way of thinking, then there's only one director, there's only one CEO, there's only one chief financial officer. But the biblical view of leadership is body. It's plurality. It's leaders leading together, some out of gifts of evangelists, and some out of gifts of prophets, and some out of gifts of apostles, and some with administrative gifts, and some with chairing meetings gifts. You see that in Acts 15 with James, a gift for leading a meeting with all the other apostles there. So with organizational thinking, it's hierarchical, and only one person can be in a given position. But with eldership, you can have a number of elders leading together, like we do have now internationally. And we have lots of different gifts in that eldership. And we each do what we're gifted to do. I'm happy to say that in the upcoming gathering of international leaders in Singapore, Darlene is primarily responsible for putting that together, because that's just her gift. I'm supporting her in it, and the others of us are supporting her in it, but she is so good at celebration, and she's so good at events. It's great that we don't have an international director who has to do that, but we've got a team, each operating in their gifts. So those are some of the implications of eldership. And I want to open up to questions in just a minute, but I also want to extend a little bit of grace here, that although we've been talking about this for 12 years now, we didn't get clear teaching on it and clear sort of implicational understanding until about 2009. And if you're listening in an area where leadership haven't really got this yet, well, I understand. I had the privilege of being together in a group and also having a strong prophetic teacher speak to me about it, and then me teach what he was saying to our international leadership. But it still took a long time for the implications of all that to drop into my heart and mind. So do be patient if you find it's not working where you are yet. Pray for them, understand them, ask questions. But gradually, the model of eldership will become the norm all over the world. There's one other implication that I didn't mention before, and then Bill has some advanced questions, and people, I think there's a chance for you to ask any questions you might have. But one of the things that is kind of a Western way of thinking, it goes with being an organization, is the idea of retirement. And for most of the world, there is a compulsory retirement age, and that holds for all people, whether they are prematurely old and aren't really functioning very well and struggle to make it to their 65 or 67 or whatever it is, or if it's somebody who's going to be vibrant well into their late 80s. There's just a sort of legal cutoff thing, and as a result of that, we miss the skills, the knowledge, the giftings of a dynamic part of our population, just in the world, but in the body of Christ even more so. I think of Lauren and Darlene. I stay with them quite a lot. I know them very well, and to be frank, each year I go there, I think I wonder if they will be showing signs of slowing down a bit. And every year so far, the answer is no. As Lauren heads towards the 80s, man, the guy is still just as apostolic and visionary as he's ever been, maybe more so. Think what it would be like if we had a firm idea of retirement, a retirement template in our heads. And 15 years ago, Lauren was considered to be the end of his career. We would have missed so much. So the idea of eldership also allows us the opportunity of letting people carry on functioning in their gifts as long as God gives them grace. And then when they no longer have grace to operate in those gifts, then they can, with honor and respect, gradually or even suddenly become less active. And we can honor them and all, but they have functioned to the full length of the grace that God's given them, and we need them. So those are some of the implications. And of course, it also gives, when we say that, then by implication, you also realize that means we can have thoroughly multi-generational leadership teams. I'm on a pretty good sized training base here. I met with our leadership team this morning. I'm not on it, but I meet with them from time to time. And we're a 3-generational leadership team. And I just love that. I meet with them, I talk to them, they ask advice. They said, do you have anything that you want to input into us? And I do. And then I can leave it with them. And I think that's really healthy to have a 3-generational leadership team like that, where elders can drop in and give advice and answer questions, and also, just keep the vision on course. So I'll stop now. There's more I could say. There always is, but I'll stop now and take any questions you might have.
All right, I've got 4 to start us out with. And so I'll read you the first one and then give you the opportunity to respond to it. So this first one came from Amos Hathaway. And it's read the article on eldering, but despite its description about describing who or what elders are, it didn't explain anything, only indicated that the group formerly known as the GLF are elders. My question is, what is the definition of an elder according to Youth of the Mission? I know the biblical description, but what it seems like we're calling an elder is broader than the biblical description. Who are the current elders? Communication is sent out saying from the YWAM elders. And this says that it's a body of elders.
Yeah, it's a good question. Not easy to answer because we are using the term very broadly. Let me say I had hoped that people wouldn't just go out and change the name of existing groups from a leadership team to an eldership team. I think that has happened in some places. But I think that there's quite a different range of people who are elders, and that's why it's hard to define. Because I do think that elder is biblically relative, and it's relative, that is, it's relational within the context of who's relating to whom. I think it's relational in YWAM too. So at a local level, you will have people who are more mature than others, and those can legitimately be called elders. Just like, when Paul went back and visited the churches that he'd preached to in the area of Phrygia, Lystra, Derbe, Iconium, so on, and they appointed elders. Those elders had probably only been believers for, well, less than a year. But in relation to the other believers in that particular local church, they were elders. And I think that's a legitimate and appropriate use of eldership. And you know how the Bible describes it. Although they hadn't been believers that long, I think we can probably safely assume that they were God-fearers for a long time. I think we can probably assume that they were, relative to the others, they knew the ways of God more. And that they complied with those conditions that Paul writes out to Titus and Timothy about being husband of one wife, and about being of good reputation, and not being given to drink, and being generous and hospitable, and all those things. So if the Bible uses it a bit in a relative way, so are we. There are some things about it, though, I think that we ought to say that I usually am known for being a little bit more blunt than most people. Just because a person is a leader doesn't make them an elder. And when they don't hold a position and no one seeks them out, then they probably aren't an elder, no matter what sort of name goes with their person. You are an elder by virtue of the fact that you have that standing in people's eyes. They want to hear from you. They will seek you out when they need wisdom or help, when they have to have a difficult relationship mediated. They come to you, or when they want to clarify the vision. You know, you wouldn't go to Lauren, for example, if you wanted mediation in a relational problem, but you would go to Lauren if you wanted him to clarify what is our overall vision. So elder means that people continue to function in the gifts that God has given them. And that's why it's a little bit hard to define. It's not that straightforward, because it is really about who a person is with their particular unique gift mix. Now, I may not have helped you, Amos, in any way by saying that, because I don't think I am making it clearer or better defined, because I don't think that's what we're about right now.
Okay, you addressed some of Amos. Actually, it was a two-part question from him, and you addressed some of the second part, but I'll read this to you, and maybe you can then just clarify a little bit. His second question was, how does this change anything if we just replace the word leader with elder, which you specifically talked about a bit? He thought that we were trying to move away from any power titles, as well as using the word elder, because it's so can mean different things cultures. So talk a little bit about that. I'm wondering if you might be able to expand a little bit more, since from my conversations with people, I don't think he's the only person who has these kind of questions.
Okay, you're breaking up just a little bit. I hope I'm not. I hope I've got good bandwidth here. Yeah, you're right. We sure don't want to just replace the word leader with elder, and I'm sorry where that's happened. As I've said, the thing about eldership is that it does imply plurality. And eldership, we really don't want to see it used as a title. We don't want to see it used as a badge that people put on. And we certainly don't want to see that as because you have that name, therefore you have a certain amount of power. It really is meant to reflect that that's how people see you, and that's the anointing on your life, so you can function that way. It's not meant in any way to be a title or position that thereby gives you power and authority. And I do think that we will have people who have been YWAM leaders who, when they no longer have that authority title of director or president or chairman or whatever, then they will kind of gradually fade into the sunset because they're not elders. People don't naturally call on them, and that's just, I think that'll be difficult on those individuals, but that's the way it is. We should not be called upon because of the title we carry. I want also to say that at a local level where YWAM is incorporated, by law and by custom in nearly every nation, we need to have some measure of organization. So we're not trying to impose this template on local YWAM everywhere. Because we deal with finances, because we deal with issues like health and safety and educational authorities and so on, we have to have organizational structure, and we have to have some organizational titles to interface with governments and with the institutions that they authorize. So we're not wanting to replace the various organizational essential organizational titles with the term elder locally by any means. But still, at a local level, the whole concept of elders with different ministry gifts should still function, even though we have to have a certain amount of organizational structure and titles. I don't know if that helps much. If we could expand that question in greater detail, or in any way clarify it, I'd be happy to go on with it. But maybe while we're waiting for that, there's a second question.
Well, Corinne actually did ask a question, just following up with what you've been sharing about already. And she just said, if I understand you correctly, you are saying that existing base leadership teams just changed the name to being an eldership team, and you wish this was not done that way. Are you suggesting that we should appoint elders in our bases?
Well, I think if you have the problem we've had in the past, but we'll put it the other way around, is you've had people who could function as elders because they were experienced, they'd carried weight and responsibility, they were still available, but there was no place for them. So where you have elders, yeah, recognize them. You know, I'm an example. I live here on this base. I haven't been the base leader for quite a long time. I've just known, and everybody else has known, it's no longer appropriate for me to carry the operational side of this place day in and day out. So the eldership title fit perfectly for me. You may have local bases where there are no elders. You know, you are local leaders, you've got a leadership team and so on, and that's fine. Don't change the name. But you may be in a place where actually, if you just had the opportunity, you could have made room for people with eldership giftings and ministries that can be really, really beneficial to you. So we have a few people around here. I'm not the only one. My wife and I aren't the only ones. We have a few people around our base who were like that. You know, when they were younger, they carried a lot of responsibility. They have a lot of wisdom in them, and those elders gather for weekly prayer. I have a prayer meeting at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning with eldership praying for our community. So it's great to have a few of those people around to be able to be called upon when the leaders need the wisdom, and for the elders to also go to them when they say when they feel something needs to be clarified. You know, that's why I met with the leadership team today. I thought there are 2 or 3 things I want to say to them, and it was such a good session.
All right, we have another question, this one from John Dunn, who's in our chat room right now. And he just asked, how would you describe the primary responsibility of an eldership team on a YWAM base?
Well, we've kind of gone round and around with that even here, because one of the questions is, do elders have final responsibility and authority, or do the leadership team have? And I kind of think that that's not a good question to ask. If it helps, you know, if there's a difficulty, then I'd say, yeah, usually elders are advisory. So they give input, but then the leadership team needs to decide what to do. But actually, in some cases, elders still carry a major responsibility. You know, let me use Lauren as an example. So Lauren is not on the leadership team in Kona. Is he advisory? Does he only advise them what to do? No, not at all. He is who he is, and he's, as an elder, he has room to function there, which means that he is the one who keeps defining the vision, keeps expanding the vision, keeps broadening the vision, and also carries major responsibility for the development of the campus financially and physically, because that's just who he is. So he's not just advisory. Some places they are. You know, my dear friend Barry Austin lives on a YWAM base. He doesn't carry direct responsibility there. He does a lot of the leadership training. So he's advisory there because the leadership team there carries all the responsibility and the authority. So the term eldership, I think, has to be, it's very broad, and it has to be crafted according to the gifts and the relationships of the particular people involved. That's, I guess, what I'm saying. Did that answer it? Repeat the question. Let's see if there's if I got anywhere close to it.
That was John Dunn just asking, how would you describe the primary responsibilities of an eldership team on a YWAM base? He actually did post a follow-up question as well, and I'll read that one to you now. So he said, what input would you give for bases that have changed their base leadership team to an eldership team? There's many bases that have done this. How would you encourage them to proceed towards truly embracing the eldership vision?
Well, I wouldn't say it's wrong. It's just that sometimes if you use the term eldership for your leadership team, then you end up not making it available for when you do truly have elders. That is, as I've described, people who are available and can be really helpful with their input and carry a lot of spiritual responsibility, prayer responsibility, without carrying implementation online responsibility. So I would say I'd rather that they found a way to move towards saving that term for those people who are doing what I've described, rather than day-to-day implementing leadership at a local level.
All right, there's a slight delay sometimes between when we speak and when they hear, so we'll wait to hear back from John in the chat room, see if he has any follow-ups.
I want to say too on this, you know, in different cultures, this is harder or easier to implement according to how cultures see authority and positions. So don't be dismayed, you know, if your base seems to have gone a slightly different direction. And don't, I'm trying not to be prescriptive. Don't, you know, suddenly change back to leadership team. Oh, we got it wrong. You know, think about what I'm talking about. Pray about it. Consider what the way ahead is. Try to think 15, 20 years in advance when you've got more older people around who could be elders. You know, how do you want to structure it? Okay.
Alrighty. We do have another one. This is actually from Kristen, and again, it's looking at, you know, how do we move towards that eldership model, and she's asking, can you give some examples of how bases and teams have applied this practically, and what does moving from organization to eldership look like?
Well, yeah, I can. I think of some bases where they had a number of, for want of a better term, retired YWAMers around because we were thinking organizationally. And this has given them the opportunity to say, hey, you know, this person, and that person are all really elders to us. They're still engaged with YWAM. They're involved, and this gives the opportunity. So some bases have simply recognize that they've got some of these people around. They've drawn them together and asked them, please, could they meet with them, you know, once every quarter or whatever, and would they please carry things in prayer, and if they have anything to say to them from the Lord, would they please say it? And that's just given space for people who would like to have had more input, but for whom there was no place. Other places, you know, I think this is really helpful, where somebody who's been, say, a base director and they've been a base director for 10 years or 15 years, but there's no place for them to go. You know, they're not ready to retire. And before, in many of us, the way we were thinking, you are a line leader and then you retire. So what happens when somebody's been a line leader for 10 years or 8 years and they feel like they're still part of this base, they're still part of this community? And we've had that in a number of instances, that once the concept of eldership became clear to people, then it gave a leader the freedom to say, oh, that's what I can do. That's where I fit. That's my role, as it were. That describes who I can be. And they can then be free to come out of the line and implementation leadership into a role of prayer, advice, counsel, and influence.
Right. You did speak before about some of the challenges that are encountered because of cultural differences, depending on where in the world we are and what, I guess, people bring into Youth of the Mission with their culture. We did have a question come in from Sarah, and she asked, we have women in the eldership. I'm guessing Darlene is part of it, but are there other women there as well? I'm talking about eldership internationally. Now, Sarah is asking this question because she's heard quite a few YWAMers say women should not be elders, and she's wondering, I guess, what the view is internationally or globally.
Yeah, that's an old biblical argument, isn't it? That rages still in certain parts of the body of Christ. And Lauren and David Hamilton wrote the book Why Not Women, and I think that's a pretty clear statement about where we are. And I think biblically, you have to say, anytime there is a statement about something like that, and then there are clear biblically recorded exceptions, and that statement is not an absolute. So I think we fully accept, more than fully accept, we joyfully embrace the idea of women in leadership. I've just been out in China with a really apostolic woman who's just pioneering way ahead of most people in China, and has been winning people to Jesus and planting churches and training missionaries for 40 years. We love that. As far as YWAM goes, yes, Darlene is on the eldership. Sometimes we also meet with spouses, so we think we can't always make it just for practical and family reasons, but we think in most of our cases it's the couple who are the eldership, because we're a package. That's certainly the case with Marty and me. We were about to expand the Founders Circle, which is that small group of people who function as the sort of global eldership. And then we had a real clear word from God from a prophetic man whom we trust deeply, saying, don't rush this. Your unity is more valuable than you think. Strengthen that, guard it, and then expand when the Lord says. And we felt like the Lord said time to expand when we were together in March. So we have quite a long list of names of people we're praying about right now, and a lot of women amongst them who we think would be potential. The question is, when we expand, where do we stop? Because there's so many people who are just highly qualified people who are widely recognized by YWAM around the world as having, they are leaders whom people respect and love. So that's what we're looking for. And of course, there are quite a significant number of women amongst those. So undoubtedly, as we expand, and we'll probably do something around expansion in Singapore that is recognizing some people, then there will be women amongst them, because there are women around the world who exercise significant global leadership. And that's what we're trying to do with the Founders Circle. We're trying to expand it with people who are recognized right around the world, not just in one bit of YWAM. So I think that's important. Anything else there, Bill?
Yeah, we had a follow-up question from Corinne. She asked the question earlier about existing base leadership teams just changing their name. So her
Yeah.
follow-up question was, she said that what you said and shared totally made sense. Um, and she's just asking, so is it correct to say that not necessarily all base leadership members should automatically assume eldership?
Yeah, I think that's fair. When I try to answer a question like that, I think of the instances I know. I have to ground it. I'm very practical about that. I can't answer it just theoretically. But I think of the base leadership teams I know, and with the team today where a youngest member was 22, I think 23, good leader. In a community like ours where there's any number of people over the age of 50, it doesn't make sense to call that 23-year-old an elder. Um, but he's a crucial leader in our team, and he keeps the LT. He and others keep the LT really in tune with the younger people on our base, and we keep leading with a view to them. So he's definitely a leader, but it just wouldn't make sense to call him an elder because there's so many spiritually mature and chronologically mature people around our base. So not everybody on a leadership team in a mature base should be called an elder. I don't think anyway. Again, it's a relative term. And in our case, a 23-year-old here is not relative to the people on the base, an elder. But he is a guy of real influence and a great guy.
All right. I'm going to give the heads up that we've got about 15 minutes left. So if
Okay.
other people do have questions, they should drop them in now. We did have another follow-up actually from John Dunn.
Okay.
He asked, with the renewed emphasis of power down and not attaching authority to titles, etc., how do you recommend structuring financial oversight on bases in a way that would not put power in the hands of a few?
Well, that's always been a question. It doesn't change very much with this shift to eldership because on the local base you still have to have financial controls and systems, and there still have to be financial decision makers. I strongly recommend that at least annually every YWAM base leadership team should have a session on finances where the annual reports, the annual summaries are laid out, policies reviewed, all questions welcomed, so that there's just a strong sense of transparency. What I despise, and I use the word advisedly, what I despise is where a few people run the finances in ways that they don't want anybody outside their group to know. Where they have policies and practices which they think, well, people will misunderstand that, we better not say anything. No, if you got something that you think people will misunderstand, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. If you can't explain it, then don't do it. Any good policy is something that you should be able to stand up and explain because there'll be a good reason for it, and it's not a selfish reason. I've been in too many situations in organizations everywhere, churches, etc., where some policies are secret because in the end they're self-interested policies on the part of the people involved. And that's just the way of the world, isn't it? Just this week I've been reading more and more, and I've got a couple of my sons are involved in businesses that are directly interfacing with governments in Africa. And the lack of transparency and the way that secretive finances corrupt people is just horrific. And we don't want any part of that. We want to be really completely transparent in what we are doing, so anybody can ask any questions and we have an answer that will stand up to the light.
Good. I think that was pretty clear. Thank you.
I hope so.
We do have a question from Isaac Aho, and he says that in your introduction to Andy Elliott's letter, you mentioned eldership and family. Do you see YWAM leadership moving to a model family structure? If so, what are some of the parallels you would see as healthy structure?
Well, you know, one of the things that is pretty obvious from reading Scripture is that Israel was really extended family in its structure, and indeed that's what eldership is about. Um, Body of Christ and family are virtually the same kind of structure. Uh, so that's why I would use the term family as much as body or as uh, any other term that we might use in it, because um, it's based on multi-generational relationships and having appropriate levels of respect and honor and freedom amongst them. So yeah, I think we are moving more towards a family structure, and the more we think of ourselves that way, the healthier we will be. Could I maybe I probably doing for
Go ahead,
time?
sir.
About around the corner here.
Yeah, we've
Um,
got about 10 minutes.
um, you know, I just finished my daily readings again. The passage that I spent quite a bit of time teaching on with the old Global Leadership Forum in 2009. I think I had 4 sessions on it, where Israel went from having a family structure, that is, they had their families, their clans, their tribes, and then beyond their tribal leaders, all they had was priests who didn't really have any authority except to be interceding between them and God, mediating. And now we're all priests, so that ministry is gone. And then they had the judges, you know, and it was under Samuel that they finally said, no, we're tired of this system. We want a king. No, we demand a king. And as they demanded a king, God said, they're rejecting me, not you, Samuel. So go back to them and say, okay, I will give you a king, but this is what he'll do. You know, he'll press your young men into his army. He will bring forced labor to build his palaces, and he will press your girls into being his cooks and his perfume makers and so on. So what he was saying is this: is when you set up an official power structure with a title that gets passed down from generation to generation within a family, and you empower that with a lot of wealth and the ability to tax and raise an army and so on, then you create a habitation for principalities and powers. The enemy loves those kinds of setups. And then what he does is he takes that thing that you're wanting to be set up for your protection and for your security, and he will use it to oppress you. And there's an incredible lesson there. There's a wonderful, really quite scary general lesson that says we set up structures, often out of our fear, often because we want things to be controllable and comfortable. And we don't like the uncertainty of waiting to see who's anointed. We want to be able to appoint people by some predictable system because we want to be secure. And God says, do that, and you'll create a way for the enemy to come into this desire and do exactly the opposite. And of course, that's what happened. Even within one generation's time, they were being oppressed. By the time Solomon was halfway through his reign, he was oppressing the people in ways that were described exactly by Samuel. So that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind. We want to be more family, like Israel was before they asked for a king. It's less predictable. It's hard to describe. It often doesn't make sense to outsiders. People often don't know who to go to. You know, during the time of Samuel, if another king sent an ambassador to come, who would he go to? Samuel wasn't interested. There was nobody. You know, so we're different. And oftentimes the reason why we set up these structures is so that we make sense to other people. But in so doing, we set up a structure that is easy for the enemy to take and warp so that it works against the purposes for which it was set up. I hope that makes sense.
feedback we've been getting so far is great. Lynn, you seem to be answering questions quite clearly, and they've been responding well. We do have one more question from Mark Frug. I might be saying that wrong, and if I am, Mark, I'm sorry. He's asking, how do eldership and leadership work and work together in welcoming and releasing, or maybe not yet releasing, new vision?
Again, I think it depends upon the giftings of the people involved. You know, to use Kona as an example, Lauren, at the age of 78 going on 79, is still the person who keeps putting the vision out there, broader, deeper, more extensive. So, and what happens with the leadership team there is that they try to organize and implement to keep up with the vision, and that's great. But there'll be other places where the person who is in leadership, you know, take our base for example. We have a leader who is somewhere between 30, about nearer 35 than 40. He is very, very visionary, especially for teams and for young people getting out there. And he's just and for the arts and whatever the vision is for outreach or for arts or whatever, the answer is yes. And he's always putting creative vision out there. Given that, then that releases some of the people like me in eldership to primarily concern ourselves with the values. Now, because our leader isn't as strong on building the University of the Nations and transformation, and he's all for it, but that's not where his heartbeat is, then it makes room for someone else, and we have another elder here, whose primary strength is that. So I think God will give a gift mix between the leadership and the eldership, and the key is finding out who's what. You know, sometimes people are primarily wise counselors when it comes to values. Sometimes they are just terrific prophetic visionary people. And just because they move from a leadership role to an eldership role won't change their primary giftings. So work out how to lean into people's strengths and not be too concerned about the things that they can't do so well. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that did. I'm hoping that that answered Mark's question. Now, John Dunn asks one more, and let's see. Yeah, sorry, Isaac Caho just says that, sorry, your answer about family and tradition and eldership was really helpful and really insightful. So he says thank you for that. And we'll take one, this will be the last question. This is from John Dunn. And he asks, I'm hearing that we are removing titles, etc., and wanting to lead out of influence, not authority, and that's awesome. But yet, someone could hear this message today and say elders are just those that don't have titles. How do we actually implement this at a base level, as bases can say this applies to regional leadership on up and titles from base leadership on down?
Yeah. Well, remember, we're not removing all titles at a local level. There are some. It's quite likely that there will be the necessity of some titles at local levels. So we shouldn't rush to this. So if you have an accountant, they still need to be your accountant, not an elder. Not necessarily an elder. So we still have here where I live, we still have a base leader. I think we're moving more to a point where a little bit more like you see in Acts 15, where there's a whole bunch of leaders. They were apostles, like Paul and Barnabas, and then there were the senior guys like Peter and James, and then there were the local Jerusalem elders who were together with them too, and they all blended together according to their gifts. So James was a guy who he just seemed to have authority to lead their hearings, their convenings. So he convened this thing and chaired it. But you notice that he wasn't the guy who actually swung the argument. This was the argument about whether or not the Gentiles needed to obey all the law, be circumcised, etc. Crucial issue. really big issue. Would make a massive difference for the direction of the church in the future. And James was in charge, but he did not sway the discussion. He waited, and everybody got to have their say. After lengthy discussion, it says, a long discussion. And you got to admire Peter, who was always quick off the mark and always quick to speak his mind. And he waited, and he waited, and he waited, knowing that he had a lot of influence. And when he spoke up, people might feel crushed if they hadn't had their say. So he waited. And when it seemed like everybody had their say, then he spoke up and he said, I was the guy that God chose to first preach to the Gentiles. And you know the story that while I was still preaching, they were filled with the Spirit, and they didn't have to be circumcised first. So why are we doing this? Then Paul and Barnabas jumped in after that, told all the stories that God was doing amongst the Gentiles. Then James finally spoke up and he said, okay, brothers, this is what we've decided. So you see there a great example of different people within a leadership, eldership grouping, some local, some international, all operating in their gifts in a sort of ad hoc way. They were not an official body, but they made an absolutely crucial decision. And then from then on, for years and years after that, wherever the apostles went, they carried those decisions. I was reading again this morning on Paul's second journey. He went out to tell all the churches what had been decided at that Jerusalem council. So get your people operating according to their gifts, whether they're called leaders or elders, get them working together. Often the people who are really elders, in the most in-depth sense of the word, will not necessarily be on the leadership team. They will meet with them regularly and give them wise advice and counsel. And sometimes they will have a little more authority than that.
All right. Sorry to do this too. Have you got time for one last question?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. This is again from Mark, just following up on his question before. He's just awesome words. How does that apply to vision from people who are not necessarily elders or leaders, but are just on staff?
Well, the tripod message that kicked this whole thing off, where God said, I've not let you go over the falls to your destruction. The tripod message was primarily about how do we stay apostolic. And we stay apostolic by everybody hearing from God and being taken seriously. So we really don't want to put the primary or exclusive responsibility for eldership or for vision on our leaders. Vision just bubbles up. Vision comes from everybody knowing they can hear from God, and they're in a safe environment in YWAM where they're free to do what God says, but they have the protection of wise counselors around them, elders, who can help them. So let's really encourage an environment. That's what I so appreciate about our current base leader here, Carl Tinian, is he has created in Western Europe and in the United Kingdom and here at our base a wonderful atmosphere of, yes, if God has spoken to you, then the answer is yes, we're behind you. And as a result, we're sending out more teams and seeing more vision bubble up than we've ever seen before. Okay?
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Lynn. We will make this video available on the YWAM.org website as well as YWAMpodcast.net. And you can, after the session's finished, I think it takes YouTube a little while just to process it, but then it'll be available on YouTube for anyone to watch. So Lynn, we thank you so much. I think one thing we could probably take away from this is that there's still a lot of questions about eldership and youth of the mission. I think last time we had to cut it off before we answered all the questions, and we've managed to do it again. So, Lynn, just thank you so much for joining us, for answering these questions. And thank you, everyone, too, in the chat room for speaking with us and for sharing and for asking your questions. And we will talk to you guys again some other time. Do you have something else to say, Lynn?
Just thanks for the way you're serving us, Bill. I enjoy these times, and thanks to everybody for tuning in and for asking questions, staying in the chat room. And I'm happy to answer questions anytime, and we can do a lot more of these as the need arises. So thank you, Bill, for your service. We appreciate it a lot.
All right. Well, thank you again, Lynn. And we will talk to you, everyone out there, another time.
Okay. Bye-bye.